This is a Bible study on the book of Daniel. I am following the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible by Scott Hahn and Curtis Mitch. Other sources and bibliography will be given at the end of this series. Why a Bible study on the book of Daniel? I chose this book because of the remarkable account of how 4 young people, taken from their homeland and carted off into exile in a pagan land, not only succeeded in that culture but had a major influence for good, being raised up to positions of authority. Through their trials, tests, and sufferings, they have many lessons to teach us. We will discuss each lesson as the chapters proceed. However, one major point needs to be highlighted right from the start, and that is this: Daniel and his friends, although mere youths, without freedom, power, or standing, resolved to maintain their relationship with God and to obey the precepts of the Torah in the face of insurmountable odds. We marvel at the faith formation these young people must have received growing up in Jerusalem, from their family, their community, and from the temple. One can also ask, given the challenge our children face in a complex, multicultural, and technologically advancing world, how can they be formed to influence for good this society through the teachings of Christ and His Church? In later podcasts, we will examine this question in detail, beginning with some general principles of faith's interaction with culture, an introduction to the new evangelization, and then more specifically, the role of the family in the new evangelization, and finally, how we can participate through our schools, the workplace, and in our parishes. With all of that by way of introduction, we now begin with some background to the book itself. The overwhelming Jewish and Christian tradition has the book of Daniel written by the prophet Daniel at around the year 535 BC. Some modern scholars take issue with both of these points, and the debate is ongoing and complicated, so I will not spend much time on it other than to say that the other position is basically that the book was written well after the events by an unknown author around the 2nd century BC in response to the attacks by Antiochus Epiphanes IV, a Greek ruler who was trying to wipe out the Jewish religion and culture at the time. And the result was a major crisis. So these modern scholars believe that the book was written to encourage the Jewish people to persevere amidst their suffering. There are, of course, many contemporary scholars who defend the traditional view that has the book of Daniel written by the prophet in the 6th century BC, and I am also holding to this position. As regards the setting, Daniel was deported to Babylon in 605 BC, where he serves in the government for 60 years during the reign of kings Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus. The events cover a very tumultuous time when the course of ancient history was shaken by power struggles, not only secular but spiritual. Regarding structure, the first 6 chapters are about Daniel the person, his courage, faith, wisdom, and piety that illustrate a remarkable person of faith, and about his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they serve, with distinction, the kings of a pagan empire. These first 6 chapters prepare the reader for another set of remarkable events in chapters 7 to 12, as God, responding to Daniel's faithfulness, discloses important prophecies, including the coming of the Messiah and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. In chapters 13 and 14, we have the beautiful story of Susanna and her conflict with wicked judges, and finally the tale of Bel and the dragon. Both of these chapters continue to praise the wisdom and courage of Daniel in protecting innocents and in debunking pagan idolatry. With that brief introduction, I will now read the text of chapter 1, and then we will go back and look at some of the highlights. So, Daniel chapter 1. Verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, handsome and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to serve in the king's palace, and to teach them the letters and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the rich food which the king ate, and of the wine which he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's rich food, or with the wine which he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear lest my lord the king, who appointed your food and your drink, should see that you were in poorer condition than the youths who are of your own age. So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the rich food of the king be observed by you, and according to what you see, deal with your servants. So he listened to them in this matter, and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's rich food. So the steward took away the rich food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all letters and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. And Daniel continued until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Now going over some of the highlights, we see that in verse 1, the setting is the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes to Jerusalem and besieges it. The Babylonian exile was long in the making, because Judah, the southern kingdom, had failed to keep the covenant that God had made with the United Kingdom way back in the book of Exodus at Mount Sinai, and after having redeemed them from slavery in Egypt. As a result of that failure, many of the prophets continually exhorted both Israel and Judah to repent and to return back to the Lord, and to put away their idol worship. In particular, the prophet Isaiah, who began his ministry in 740 BC and concluded it in 681 BC, and the prophet Jeremiah, who was a contemporary of Daniel, both exhorted Judah to return to the Lord. So in verse 2 of Daniel chapter 1 it states, quote, And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. End of quote. The first point to notice is that God is in control. The word for Lord in verse 2 is Adonai, which name has the sense of sovereign ruler. And notice it's Daniel who is writing this toward the end of his captivity, around 535 BC. Daniel is an old man, and he's looking back and has seen God's hand in all of these events, in this great calamity. It's not King Nebuchadnezzar who controls history, it's the Lord. Now, the fact that some of the vessels are taken from the temple in Jerusalem and put in this pagan temple sets up a conflict between the pagan gods of Babylon and the one true God of Israel, and this becomes a continuing theme throughout the book. It should be noted that 100 years earlier, King Hezekiah had shown off all the temple vessels and treasuries to envoys of the then reigning king of Babylon. The prophet Isaiah chastised Hezekiah for this foolish act, for trusting more in riches than God, and predicted that Babylon would one day cart off all of these treasures. So, quoting from the book of Isaiah, chapter 39, starting at verse 5, quote, "Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, 'Hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your fathers have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born of you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." End of quote. So Nebuchadnezzar commands his chief eunuch, Ashpenaz, to bring some of the best and brightest Jews taken from Judah into his palace for retraining so that they can serve the king. This was typical of Nebuchadnezzar when he conquered a nation, that he would take the most talented and useful people back to Babylon and allow the rest of the population, the poor and the uneducated, to live in peace. So this is how Daniel, as a young man, comes to be deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now the question is, would Nebuchadnezzar be successful in converting Daniel and his three friends from their Jewish upbringing, their traditional religion and culture, to an entirely new world view? To do that, they would first be taught the language of Aramaic, and then Babylonian philosophy and literature and poetry, and their pantheon of gods. The social engineering would be aided by a program of threats if they resisted and promises of material comfort if they conformed. We see the material enticements in verse 5, quote, "The king assigned them a daily portion of the rich food which the king ate and the wine which he drank." End of quote. Secondly, in an attempt to change their Jewish identity, Babylonian names were assigned. Names at this time in history were important as denoting essence or character. So the name Daniel means, "God is my judge," and that's changed to Belteshazzar, meaning, "Lady, protect the king." Hananiah, which means, "Yahweh has been gracious," is changed to Shadrach, meaning, "I am fearful of God." Mishael, which means, "Who can compare to my God," is changed to Meshach, which means, "I am despised." And Azariah, meaning, "Yahweh has helped," to Abednego, which means the servant of Nebo. So, by a new identity, no longer as Jews in a covenant relationship with Yahweh, but now as servants to Babylon and its gods, Nebuchadnezzar tries to reprogram these four young men to erase their memory of God and his laws. How does Daniel respond? In verse 8, we have the answer. It states, quote, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's rich food or the wine which he drank." End of quote. So from this early point of Daniel's captivity, he makes a deliberate decision, almost in the sense of a covenant, not to compromise. And it's not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but one that Daniel would have carefully planned ahead of time. Daniel draws a line in the sand and stakes out his position, knowing that compliance at this early stage would surely mean his defeat. Now, this is quite remarkable because Daniel here is in a very vulnerable position. He is still a youth. He has been forcibly removed from his parents and friends back in Jerusalem, his identity changed, and he must have realized that to refuse the king's graciousness in this food and wine would have been an insult. And also there would have been peer pressure, as all of the other youths would most likely have capitulated, so that Daniel would stand out. Daniel, as a young man, could have reasoned that since he has been forcibly taken from his religion and his home, God has abandoned him, and therefore the smart thing to do is to submit and survive. So why does Daniel put himself at risk in refusing the king's favor? He does not want to offend God, and he knows that if he were to eat the food offered to him, the Torah would be violated, as the food was unclean and previously sacrificed to idols. In refusing to submit, Daniel shows great trust in the Lord. One is reminded here of the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel, when he faces the 450 prophets of Baal, and Elijah goes before the people and says, quote, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." And the people remain silent. End of quote. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 20. So here we have Daniel in this critical phase of reprogramming by Nebuchadnezzar, resolving not to defile himself, to remain faithful to the Lord. For us today, a good question for reflection would be, in what ways are we being tested? What are there areas of weakness or vulnerability where we are tempted to act contrary to God in a manner that would lead us away from him? What steps have we taken to shore up our defense? Have we a plan? Have we thought out in advance? Are we resolved not to allow societal pressure to compromise our standards? What price are we prepared to pay for holiness? What is the cost of discipleship? Another question, what friendships are we cultivating that will strengthen our faith? For Daniel and his 3 friends, their common love of God and devotion to his commandments was crucial. Do we belong to a small faith community who gather regularly to pray, worship the Lord, and hold each other accountable? These are questions for reflection. Now back to the story. Having resisted, Daniel also acts prudently. He enters into negotiation with Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, by suggesting a test for 10 days on a restricted diet of vegetables and water, to see whether, at the end of that period, his appearance is better than those youths who gave in. In verse 9, we have the important statement, quote, "And God gave Daniel favor," end of quote. God therefore intervenes on behalf of Daniel, and this grace given throughout his captivity in Babylon relativizes all political and military power, every human wisdom, all that Nebuchadnezzar was trying to throw at Daniel. It is because of Daniel's faith that he is led to issue the challenge, and God responds with favor. In verse 15 we read, quote, "At the end of the 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's rich food." So Daniel gains an important victory at this early part of the story while still a young man. This resolve to stand firm in the face of powerful enticements will be crucial to the story and Daniel's victory in the end, because faith builds upon faith. And in the following chapters, the test will become even more severe. So, as Daniel was given favor as regards food and drink, God also gives him favor as regards learning. Verse 17 states, quote, "As for these 4 youths, God gave learning and skill in all letters and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams." End of quote. And then verse 19 adds, quote, "The king spoke with them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. End of quote. There is a correlation here between the 10-day test that Daniel issued to Ashpenaz and the 10 times better in learning he acquires through God's favor. God rewarded Daniel's faith that was tested by giving him even more of the gifts he would need in his continuing struggle. As the New Testament letter of St. James states in chapter 1, starting at verse 1, quote, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." End of quote. The letter of 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 6 is also relevant here. Quote, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have to suffer grief of all kinds of trials. These have come, so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even through the fire, may be proved genuine, and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." End of quote. Throughout chapter 1, God's favor is having its effect as Daniel makes tremendous progress. In verses 3 to 7, he is a captive in Babylon with no power or influence and is being subjected to terrible reprogramming. But by verses 8 through 16, Daniel is holding his ground. He resists. And finally, in verses 17 to 20, there is success. King Nebuchadnezzar himself recognizes Daniel's value. So the flow is from subservience to resistance to success. Daniel and his friends go from the lowest to the highest, and by the end of the chapter are at the head of the royal palace. And in the background is God quietly at work, as it states again in verse 9, quote, "And God gave Daniel favor." End of quote. In a way, this opening chapter reminds us of the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. He was forced from his land, family, and father, and brought into Egypt as a captive, and tempted to sin against God through the pleasures of the flesh. And he refuses. He takes his stand. Joseph remains faithful to the Lord and is eventually raised up to the court of the Pharaoh and given a high position of influence, which he uses to help both Israel and Egypt. Again, God's providence was at work. There are many other parallels as well. Joseph has the ability to interpret dreams like Daniel, and in each case, the pagan wise men are shown to be inept. Also, in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verse 15, when the 10-day test was concluded, it states, quote, "They were fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate at the king's table." End of quote. The expression fatter in flesh is similar to Joseph's story, where the 7 cows in Pharaoh's dream were fatter in flesh, indicating 7 years of plenty, thereby enabling Joseph to advise Pharaoh to prepare for the coming famine. We see another reason why Daniel and his friends succeeded in the face of Nebuchadnezzar's social engineering. Although their names were changed, Daniel and his friends continued to identify themselves among themselves using their Hebrew names, thereby resisting the assimilation. They were true to their name. Daniel, God is my judge. Hananiah, Yahweh has been generous. Mishael, who can compare with God? Azariah, Yahweh has helped. The concluding verse 21 states, quote, "And Daniel continued until the 1st year of King Cyrus." End of quote. In other words, Daniel outlasted both Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, illustrating that human power is fleeting. One is reminded of the prophet Isaiah in chapter 40, verses 23 and 24, quote, God brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner than they take root in the ground, that he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them all away like chaff. End of quote. So King Cyrus conquers Babylon, and his Persian Empire assimilates all that Babylon had acquired. And while the mighty Babylon falls, Daniel endures. He was secure in the midst of this great turmoil because he put his faith in God. As the book of Proverbs states in chapter 19, verse 21, quote, "Many are the plans in the mind of man, but it is the purposes of the Lord that will be established." End of quote. In the next podcast, we will look at some of the lessons that can be learned from this opening chapter and how to apply them to our lives.